welcome back. Tonight, we're going to step quietly into the world of a medieval feast. Imagine long wooden tables under flickering torchlight, the sound of music and chatter echoing through stone halls, and platters of food that were far less glamorous than they first appeared. In this story, we'll explore what it really meant to sit at one of these banquets, the food, the hygiene, the hidden politics, and the many ways such a feast could test your comfort, your patience, and even your survival. So, settle in, get comfortable, and before we begin, I'd love to know, from which city are you watching tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? Imagine for a moment that you are stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval great hall. The evening feast is about to begin, and though you might picture dazzling displays of wealth, golden goblets, and plates stacked high with rich delicacies, what you would actually encounter is something far less glamorous. The first thing to hit you would not be the sight of food, but the smell. The hall is thick with smoke. Torches line the walls, their flames spitting and crackling, filling the air with soot. The hearths have been burning since morning, roasting whole animals on spits, boiling thick stews in iron cauldrons, and baking heavy loaves of bread. There are no chimneys to carry the smoke neatly away. Instead, it lingers, stinging your eyes, coating your clothes, and making every breath feel heavier than the last. The floor beneath your feet is covered, not with clean stone, but with straw, rushes, and reeds scattered loosely to soak up spills. Weeks, sometimes months, pass before these are changed. Hidden beneath the layer are scraps of old food. Bones gnawed to the marrow, grease, and even the droppings of small animals that scurry about unseen. The rushes are meant to disguise the mess, but to your modern senses, the stench would be overwhelming. Now you look up and see the tables. Long planks of wood balanced on trestles, stretching down the hall, crowded on both sides with benches. Only the highest-ranking nobles sit in chairs, and even these are little more than carved wood with hard, straight backs. At the far end of the hall is a raised platform where the lord and lady of the castle preside over the feast. Their position is not just symbolic, it is practical too. From this vantage point, they can be seen by everyone, commanding respect and attention with every gesture. The tables are not set with the gleaming silverware you might expect. Instead, food is served on trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, sometimes a day or two old, used as makeshift plates. Knives are personal possessions, brought from home and carefully kept at the belt. Forks, as you know them, do not yet exist. Instead, you would use your fingers, tearing meat apart with your hands, dipping into sauces, and wiping grease across your tunic or onto the rushes beneath the table. The food itself is not what you might imagine. Yes, there are great joints of roasted meat and pies stuffed with fillings, both sweet and savory. But there are also dishes that would unsettle you. Meats spiced heavily to mask the taste of age. Fish that has traveled for days without proper preservation. Sauces that combine sugar, vinegar, and exotic spices in ways unfamiliar to the modern palate. And yet, you cannot simply refuse what is placed before you. To reject food at a banquet is not just a matter of taste. It is a matter of respect. Every dish carries with it a message of wealth, power, and status. To turn away from a serving might be interpreted as an insult to the cook, to the host, and to the very Lord who has offered his hospitality. The hall grows louder as the evening progresses. Musicians play pipes and drums, their rhythms clashing with the roar of voices. Minstrels tell tales of distant battles or sing ballads of love and betrayal. Children dart between benches, servants rush with jugs of ale and wine, and dogs weave under the tables, snapping at bones tossed casually to the ground. But beneath the laughter and the spectacle lies an uncomfortable truth. Banquets were not simply about celebration. They were stages upon which power was displayed, alliances tested, and reputations built or destroyed. Your seat at the table told everyone else where you stood in the hierarchy of the hall. Too close to the Lord, and you might find yourself the subject of envy or suspicion. Too far away, and you risk being forgotten altogether. And while you sit there, trying to make sense of it all, you feel the weight of the air pressing down. The noise, the smoke, the smells, and the sheer closeness of so many bodies all together in one hall. Your modern senses, accustomed to clean air, quiet dining rooms, and neatly arranged plates, would already be exhausted, and the meal has barely begun. As the servants begin to bring out the first courses, you notice how unevenly the food is distributed. The most elaborate dishes, spiced venison, delicate pastries, imported fruits preserved in honey, are carried directly to the raised table where the Lord and his honored guests sit. The lower tables receive simpler fare, coarse bread, thick pottage made from barley and peas, and cuts of meat that are far less desirable. If you were of low status, your trencher might hold little more than a slice of salted pork and a ladle of watery stew. Yet even this is more than what most peasants outside the castle walls eat in a week. For them, the idea of attending a banquet at all is little more than fantasy. The food is served in courses, but these are not neat and tidy sequences. Instead, dozens of dishes might arrive at once, roasts, pies, fish, vegetables, and are laid out across the table for you to share with those sitting nearby. There is no sense of personal servings. Instead, you must reach out, take what you can, and make do with whatever arrives within arm's reach. The strongest elbows often fare best. As the evening wears on, the hall grows hotter and more stifling. The torches flare, the fires roar, and the sheer crush of bodies makes the air almost unbreathable. You feel sweat prickling at your neck, your clothing clinging uncomfortably to your skin. Yet the feast goes on. You might think of drinking water to refresh yourself, but this is not offered. Water is often unsafe, carrying diseases that can kill. Instead, there is ale, weak by modern standards, but brewed to be consumed daily. For the wealthy, there is wine, sweetened, spiced, sometimes watered down, but always flowing. And so you drink, and you drink more, because there is little else to quench your thirst. Soon you realize that the noise has risen to an almost overwhelming pitch. The music competes with the chatter of voices, the barking of dogs, the clatter of dishes, and the calls of servants rushing back and forth. Conversation becomes shouting, laughter becomes raucous, and the atmosphere turns from celebration to chaos. For someone accustomed to the quiet of modern dining, the sheer intensity is exhausting. And then there are the dangers you might not notice at first. The meat, heavily spiced, is often cooked days in advance. The fish carried inland from the coast has been preserved in salt or simply smoked. but the risk of spoilage remains high. Food poisoning was a common, if unspoken, reality of these feasts. To eat heartily was to take a gamble, and the consequences could last long after the music had faded. Beyond the physical discomforts, there are social risks as well. Banquets were not merely meals, they were performances. Every glance, every gesture, every bite carried meaning. To eat too greedily might mark you as uncivilized. To eat too little might suggest disdain. To speak at the wrong time or to contradict the wrong person could earn you more than embarrassment. It could shape your reputation for years to come. Imagine yourself there, sitting among strangers, unsure of the rules, the etiquette, the unspoken expectations. You are being watched, not just by your table-mates, but by those seated farther up the hall. Every move you make tells others who you are, where you belong, and whether you are worthy of respect. And as the evening stretches on, you feel the weight of the hall pressing down on you. The smells, the noise, the heat, the constant need to perform. Hours pass, courses blend together, and the feast becomes a test not of enjoyment, but of endurance. You realize now that to survive a medieval banquet is not only to eat, but to withstand discomfort, to navigate politics, and to accept the risks hidden in every dish and every interaction. As the feast stretches deep into the night, the atmosphere changes in subtle but important ways. At the beginning, there was ceremony, the respectful silence when the lord and lady first took their seats, the orderly arrival of the first dishes, the formal blessing before the meal. But now, hours later, those niceties are gone. The ale and wine have loosened tongues, and the once carefully arranged seating has begun to unravel into clusters of noise. Servants still dart about, refilling jugs and clearing trenchers, but their movements are slower now, weighed down by exhaustion. They have been working since dawn, and their tasks are far from finished. At your table, the trenchers are sodden with grease and broth, sagging under the weight of discarded scraps. By the end of the meal, they will not be thrown away, but given to the poor waiting outside, or fed to the household dogs. A gift, perhaps, but one that tells you much about how food was valued in this world. Nothing wasted, everything repurposed. The heat is unbearable. The fires in the hearth have not dimmed, and the sheer press of bodies makes the air suffocating. Sweat glistens on foreheads, dampens clothing, and mixes with the thick smells of roast meat, spilled ale, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present smoke. The mixture is dizzying. For someone used to modern ventilation, it is a test of endurance. Entertainment, once a distraction, now adds to the overwhelming noise. Jugglers throw wooden balls and knives in the torchlight. Minstrels strum out-of-tune strings, and jesters perform crude jokes that elicit more drunken laughter than genuine amusement. Stories of heroic battles, exaggerated and embellished, fill the hall, competing with the laughter and clamor. Yet amid the noise and spectacle, danger remains close. Brawls break out easily in such crowded spaces. A spilled drink, a misplaced insult, or the wrong word said too loudly can escalate into a scuffle. The Lord's guards keep a watchful eye, ready to intervene, but they cannot be everywhere at once. And you, an outsider, unfamiliar with the unspoken rules, might not even realize what offense you've caused until it is too late. The food itself becomes harder to stomach as the hours pass. Rich, heavy dishes pile upon one another, each spiced more heavily than the last. Your stomach, unused to such density, churns uncomfortably, but etiquette dictates that you continue to eat when food is placed before you, lest you insult your host. The feast is no longer about pleasure, but about survival, and survival is not guaranteed. Disease spreads easily in such close quarters. A single contaminated dish could sicken dozens. The very air you breathe, thick with smoke and germs, is enough to leave you coughing for days. What seems like a joyous occasion is, in truth, a breeding ground for illness. By the time the final course arrives, often something sweet, like preserved fruits or spiced wine, you are drained. Your senses are dulled, your body aches from the hard benches, and your mind longs for quiet. Yet the hall remains alive with noise, the celebration far from finished. Some guests will stay drinking until dawn. You realize now that the banquet was never truly about food or even about celebration. It was about display of wealth, of status, of endurance. To be invited was an honor, but to survive it was a challenge. And this is only the surface, because beyond the great hall, hidden away from sight, lies the true heart of the banquet, the kitchens. Here, away from the music and the laughter, countless hands worked to prepare every dish, every loaf, every jug of ale. Without them, there could be no feast at all. The smoke of the great hall is nothing compared to the inferno of the kitchens. Fires burn constantly, cauldrons boil endlessly, and the labor never ceases. To understand the banquet fully, the servants, and the endless work that made these feasts. When you step away from the roaring noise of the great hall, the sound does not disappear. It follows you faintly, the muffled roar of laughter, the clatter of wooden mugs, the singing of drunken voices. But as you push open the heavy wooden doors at the far side of the castle, a different world greets you, the kitchens. Here, the first thing you notice is the heat. It hits like a wall. Massive hearths line the walls, each one blazing with fire that has burned since before dawn. Iron cauldrons bubble endlessly. Spits turn slowly, with whole animals skewered upon them, and the air shimmers with smoke and steam. To step inside is to step into an inferno. The second thing you notice is the smell. Not the mingled scents of meat and spice that filled the great hall, but something more raw, more overwhelming. Boiling fat, burning wood, scalding milk, singed hair, all layered upon one another until it is difficult to separate one from the other. Your nose stings with the sharpness of smoke, and then comes the movement. The kitchens are never still. Servants rush past you, carrying buckets of water, platters of food, baskets of bread, or freshly plucked birds. Boys, no older than 12, turn the heavy spits by hand, their faces shiny with sweat, while older cooks shout orders above the roar of fire. The room is chaos, but a practiced chaos. Every person knows their place, and if they falter, the entire system collapses. In this world, survival means something different than in the great hall. There, you needed to navigate etiquette, endure noise, and avoid offending the wrong person. Here, survival means keeping your body intact. Burns, cuts, and accidents are constant. A slip of the knife, a spilled pot of boiling broth, or a falling iron pan could mean lifelong injury. Medical care, if it came at all, was crude and painful. And yet, for the servants, there was no choice. Their work was relentless. A banquet was not a single meal, but a cycle that stretched for days. Preparations began long before the guests arrived, slaughtering animals, grinding grain, brewing ale, storing vegetables, and preparing sauces. And long after the last guest stumbled away from the table, the kitchens remained alive, cleaning, preserving leftovers, and preparing for the next feast. The hierarchy here is strict. At the top stands the master cook, a figure as vital to the household as any knight or steward. His word is law. Beneath him are skilled assistants, each responsible for certain dishes, and below them a swarm of servants, boys, and scullions who do the dirtiest tasks. You, if placed in this world, would likely find yourself at the very bottom, scrubbing pots blackened with soot, carrying water from the well, or plucking feathers from birds until your fingers bled. But it is not only the work that threatens you, it is the air itself. In a time before chimneys were common, smoke often had no place to go. It filled the room, blackening the ceilings, stinging eyes, and coating lungs. To work here day after day meant a lifetime of coughing and shortened breath. Historians believe many kitchen workers lived short lives, their bodies broken not by battle, but by heat, smoke, and exhaustion. And yet, despite all of this, there is an odd kind of pride here. To serve in the kitchens of a great household meant you had a place, however humble, in the rhythm of power. To prepare the Lord's table, to ensure the feast continued without pause, was to be part of something larger. The guests in the hall never saw this world, but they depended on it completely. As you stand in the kitchens, sweat dripping down your forehead, smoke burning your throat, and the roar of fires pressing against your ears, you realize something. This is the true heart of the banquet. Not the laughter of lords and ladies, but the endless toil of those who worked unseen, their labor hidden behind the heavy doors. And this is only the beginning, because behind the fires and the chaos of the kitchens lies another story: the servants themselves. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what did survival mean in their world of endless work and little reward? If you linger long enough in the kitchens, your eyes begin to adjust to the smoke and your ears to the endless clatter. You start to notice the faces behind the movement, the men, women, and children who make the banquet possible. At first glance, they seem like shadows, moving quickly with buckets or hunched over chopping blocks. But each one carries a story. Each one has a life that begins long before the fires are lit and continues long after the feast is forgotten. Most of the servants here are young. Some are the children of peasants, sent to the castle for work when they were barely strong enough to carry a bucket. Others were born into servitude, following in the footsteps of parents who served before them. To be sent to the kitchens was not a choice. It was survival. Families too poor to feed every mouth often gave a child to the Lord's household, where they would at least be clothed and fed, though just barely. Their days are long. Before the first light of dawn, they are awake, fetching water, gathering firewood, and preparing the fires. The heavy pots, some large enough to boil an entire sheep, must be scrubbed and set in place. Meat must be salted, vegetables washed, bread dough kneaded. By the time the banquet begins, they have already been at work for 10 or 12 hours. And when the last guest departs, they still cannot rest. The aftermath of a feast is its own labor: washing, scraping, storing, and preparing for tomorrow. Sleep, when it comes, is brief and often uncomfortable. Servants rarely have rooms of their own. They sleep wherever there is space, on floors near the kitchens, in drafty corners of the castle, or in shared quarters with little warmth. The smell of smoke clings to their clothes, their hair, their skin. Even in sleep, the fires of the kitchen follow them. Discipline in this world is harsh. A mistake, whether it be burning a dish or dropping a platter, can earn a scolding at best or punishment at worst. The master cook's word is absolute, and beneath him, senior servants enforce strict order. A careless slip of the hand may mean hunger for an entire table of guests and humiliation for the household. In such an environment, fear and obedience keep the system running. But fear is not the only weight they carry. There is also the constant risk of illness, the smoke that never clears, the damp stone floors, the endless lifting and bending all wear down the body. Coughs become permanent, backs bend too soon, and hands roughen into calloused tools. Many servants do not grow old. They fade in their 30s or 40s, broken by a life of labor. And yet, amidst the exhaustion, there are glimmers of humanity. A kitchen boy learning to roast meat with pride, his face lighting up when the master approves. A maid sneaking a bite of bread when no one is looking. Laughter whispered between workers as they share stories in the quiet moments after the fires dim. These fragments of joy, however small, are what keep them moving. You begin to see how different this world is from the banqueting hall above. The lords and ladies feast for a single evening, but for the servants, the feast is endless. It repeats day after day, season after season, year after year. For them, survival is not about impressing a guest or navigating politics. It is about enduring the monotony, the pain, and the weight of a life that leaves little room for dreams. And yet, even here, ambition exists. Some servants hope to rise through the ranks, to become assistants, to gain a permanent place in the household, perhaps even to manage a kitchen one day. For the lowest born, this was as close as they might ever come to stability. A secure position in a noble household meant food on the table and a roof overhead, even if it came at the cost of freedom. As you watch, you realize that this life, though invisible to the nobles above, is the true backbone of the banquet. Without these unseen hands, the feast would collapse. The lords and ladies may never know their names, but the survival of the event and the survival of the household itself rests upon their labor. And so the question lingers: if you, with your modern comforts, were suddenly placed in this world, could you endure it? Could you wake before dawn, work until your body ached, breathe in smoke each day, and still find the will to return tomorrow? Step back with me now, away from the smoke-filled kitchens, through the heavy wooden doors, and into the great hall once more. The contrast is startling. Where the kitchens roared with fire and sweat, the hall glimmers with torchlight and music. Here, the feast appears glorious, but beneath the surface, another kind of danger waits. At first glance, the hall seems like a place of joy, laughter, song, and endless food. But if you look closer, you realize that every detail carries meaning. Nothing in this world is simple. The placement of a chair, the raising of a goblet, even the way you tear your bread, each action speaks louder than words. In the medieval banquet, Survival was as much about etiquette as it was about appetite. The first trap lies in the seating arrangement. You do not choose where you sit. The lord of the house does. Your place at the table is not random, but a precise reflection of your social standing. The closer you are to the Lord, the higher your honor. To be pushed further away is to be reminded of your insignificance. And if you find yourself seated near the servants' end of the hall, it is a silent signal that you have little worth. Imagine, then, the tension each guest felt as they waited to see where their place would be. Once seated, the rules multiply. Forks, for example, are not yet common in much of medieval Europe. You eat with your fingers, with a shared knife, or with bread used as a scoop. But this does not mean manners are absent. Quite the opposite. To take too much food, to chew too loudly, to lick your fingers or wipe them on your sleeve could mark you as uncivilized. Guests are expected to show restraint even when food is abundant. And the food itself is a test. Dishes are served in courses, often beginning with soups and roasts, moving on to fish, pies, stews, and finishing with sweets and fruit. But the timing is everything. To reach too eagerly, to begin before the Lord has lifted his hand, is an insult. To refuse a dish may seem ungrateful, but to take too much may appear greedy. Balance is survival. The drinks bring their own risks. Ale and wine flow freely. Yet drunkenness is a trap. To drink too little is suspicious. Are you rejecting the hospitality of your host? But to drink too much is worse. A drunken tongue can betray secrets, reveal alliances, or insult a neighbor. Many a reputation has been destroyed, not by the clash of swords, but by careless words at a feast. Conversation, too, is a weapon. A banquet is not merely about food. It is a stage where politics are played. Every compliment, every jest, every silence has weight. Guests are expected to flatter the Lord without appearing insincere, to join in laughter without seeming foolish, and to speak without overstepping their place. A single poorly chosen remark could damage alliances that took years to build. Even the entertainment is a test. Minstrels sing songs, jesters perform tricks, and sometimes knights tell stories of valor. To ignore the entertainment is rude. To mock it is dangerous. Yet to show too much enthusiasm for a performance the Lord dislikes can also put you at odds. In such an environment, the safest path is often to mirror the mood of the host, a skill easier said than done. As you sit among the lords and ladies, you begin to feel the weight of the invisible rules pressing down on you. The feast is not a place of freedom, but of scrutiny. Every movement, every gesture is noticed. You cannot simply relax and enjoy the food. You must survive it, carefully balancing hunger, manners, and the unspoken politics of the room. And all the while, danger lingers in other forms. The food itself may not be safe. Spoiled meat, poorly brewed ale, or contaminated water could make you sick for days. In an age without refrigeration, even the most carefully prepared banquet carried risks. To fall ill after a feast was common, and sometimes fatal. So you sit, carefully picking at your food, smiling at the right moments, nodding in polite agreement, while your heart quietly races. The hall looks like celebration, but you now understand it is also a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of words, glances, and subtle gestures. And survival here requires as much vigilance as any war. At the height of the evening, the hall had been alive with noise, the pounding of mugs on wood, the rising songs of minstrels, the shouts of drunken laughter, the clatter of bones tossed carelessly to the floor. But slowly, as the night wears on, the torches burn lower, the wine runs thin, the musicians grow weary, and one by one the guests drift away into the shadows of the castle. And then, as if a spell has broken, silence begins to creep back into the room. What remains behind is not glory, but wreckage. The long tables, so carefully prepared at the start of the evening, are now covered with the remnants of excess. Bones gnawed to the marrow, stale crusts of bread soaked with gravy, half-empty jugs of ale tipped over to spill sticky puddles across the boards. Wax from the candles has melted into thick pools, clinging to the wood like hardened tears. And on the rush-strewn floor, scraps of meat and pools of drink mix with dirt and ash, forming a foul-smelling carpet beneath your feet. For the nobles, this aftermath is unseen. They have already withdrawn to their chambers, some collapsing into heavy beds, others lingering in private rooms to whisper about alliances or boast about the night's successes. Their role in the banquet is over. But for the servants, the true labor has only just begun. The first task is clearing. Servants move silently, their arms aching with fatigue, but their faces expressionless, trained to endure without complaint. Platters must be carried away, scraps collected, jugs retrieved. The remains of the feast are not wasted entirely. Some are fed to the household animals, others distributed as alms to the poor who wait outside the castle gates. But much is simply thrown away, left to rot in middens that already reek of past banquets. The air grows heavy with the smell of decay, a stark contrast to the scents that filled the hall only hours before. And you realize how fleeting luxury truly is. What dazzled the senses at the start of the evening now lies broken and spoiled, forgotten as quickly as it was celebrated. The second task is cleaning. Floors must be swept of bones and spilled drink. Candles must be scraped from wood. Cups and trenchers, stained and greasy, must be scrubbed in icy water fetched from the wells. The work stretches into the early hours of the morning, long after the lords and ladies have drifted into sleep. By the time the first light of dawn touches the castle walls, the hall must once again be ready, as if nothing had ever happened. But not all remnants of the feast are physical. Some are written on the bodies of the guests themselves. For many nobles, the night ends in discomfort. Overeating is as much a danger as hunger in this world. To consume endless meat, rich sauces, heavy bread, and sweet desserts, all washed down with tankards of ale and wine, leaves the body bloated and ill. Accounts from the time speak often of banquet sickness, the pain of stomachs stretched too far, the dizziness of drink, the fevers and cramps that followed days later. Without the knowledge of modern medicine, many did not connect their illness to the feast, but the consequences were real nonetheless. For others, the consequences were more dangerous still. Spoiled food was common, especially in warmer months, when preservation was difficult. Meat might be undercooked, fish might have spoiled on the journey, or bread might be laced with mold. To eat heartily was to gamble with your health. Some guests did not wake the next morning. And then there were the quieter dangers, the words spoken too freely after too much drink, a careless insult, a boast, a whisper overheard. These could linger long after the feast itself had faded, fueling rivalries and planting the seeds of future conflict. The banquet, though dressed as celebration, was often the birthplace of betrayal. Meanwhile, the servants carry on. Their bodies ache, their lungs sting from the smoke, and their hands are raw from hours of labor. Yet they do not rest, because the castle never sleeps, not truly. Another day begins, and with it another cycle of labor. The banquet may be over, but survival, for them, is endless. As you watch the hall slowly return to silence, you begin to understand something profound. A medieval banquet was never just a meal. It was a performance, a display of wealth and power, a reminder of hierarchy. But behind every gesture of generosity, behind every platter and goblet, lay exhaustion, danger, and waste. What glittered for a few hours often left scars that lasted far longer, and this is only the beginning of the aftermath, because beyond the physical wreckage lies the deeper impact on society, on health, on the very culture of the time. The banquet did not end when the guests left the hall. Its echoes stretched outward into politics, into medicine, into the daily survival of those who lived beneath its shadow. If you leave the castle hall in the quiet hours after the feast, stepping out through its heavy doors and into the cool night air, you notice something striking. Beyond the torches, beyond the echo of music and laughter that now lies dim, there is silence, a silence that stretches across the fields, the villages, the sleeping world beyond. For the peasants who live in the shadows of the castle walls, the banquet is both distant and painfully near. They will never sit at those tables, never taste the roasted boar or the spiced wine, never laugh beside the lords and ladies. And yet, in many ways, they are the ones who made it possible. The grain ground into bread, the animals slaughtered for meat, the vegetables pulled from the earth. These were the fruits of peasant labor. For weeks, sometimes months, the fields had been worked, the animals raised, the stores gathered, and when the feast called, much of that work vanished into the castle. The peasants, left behind, ate little more than barley bread, porridge, and thin soups. While the nobles feasted on variety, those outside the gates survived on repetition. The banquet was, in its way, a reminder of distance. The Lord's abundance was built upon the scarcity of his people. One family's night of excess could mean weeks of hunger for those who tilled the soil. And yet the peasants did not revolt, for this was the rhythm of their world. To question the feast was to question the hierarchy itself, something few dared to do. Still, they felt its presence. On the morning after, poor families might gather near the gates, waiting in the hope that scraps would be thrown to them. Some lords, eager to display generosity, did indeed order the leftovers distributed, bones with bits of meat still clinging, bread too hard for noble teeth, fruits beginning to spoil. For the poor, these were treasures. A child with a stale crust of bread might feel, for one brief day, the shadow of the feast. But not all consequences were so kind. The feast often meant heavier burdens for those below. Fields left untended while servants were pulled into the castle. Food taken in abundance, leaving little for the winter months. Taxes raised to fund the endless cycle of hospitality and display. For peasants, the banquet was not celebration, but sacrifice. And yet, in the medieval world, the feast carried meaning beyond hunger. It was a symbol. To see the torches blazing on the castle walls, to hear the distant music, to watch the lords parade in their finest garments. It was a reminder of power. The banquet proclaimed that the Lord had wealth enough to waste, food enough to spare, and authority enough to summon guests from far and near. In a society where survival was fragile, such displays mattered. To the nobles, it reinforced their status among equals. To the peasants, it reminded them of the unbridgeable gulf that separated their lives from the glittering halls above. Even if the feast lasted only a single night, its echo lingered in memory, strengthening the very structure of inequality that defined the age. But the banquet also had cultural ripples. It was in these halls that alliances were forged, disputes were settled, and marriages were arranged. The politics of kingdoms often unfolded not on battlefields, but at tables. A promise whispered over a cup of wine, a bond sealed with a shared dish, a rivalry born from a careless insult. These were the moments that shaped dynasties. And so, even those far from the hall felt the impact. A peasant might not know what was said between two lords as they tore into roasted venison, but they might one day feel its weight when new taxes were levied, or when wars broke out that demanded their labor, their sons, and their lives. The banquet was never just a meal. It was the backdrop for decisions that rippled outward, shaping the fate of entire regions. It also left its mark on culture in subtler ways. Recipes passed down from cooks became traditions. Songs sung by minstrels spread from castle to village, carrying stories of knights, saints, and lovers into the common tongue. Even fashion filtered outward. The silks and furs displayed at the banquet became dreams for those who would never wear them, slowly influencing styles in villages and towns. The banquet hall was not sealed away. It was a center of gravity, pulling society toward it even as it pushed most people away. And yet, for all its influence, the feast was fleeting. The torches burned out, the platters emptied, the alliances forgotten or broken. For the peasants who trudged through the fields, for the servants who coughed in the smoky kitchen, for the children who went hungry, while nobles ate until they were sick, the banquet was not a moment of joy, but a reminder of distance. As you step back and imagine the scene, the castle glowing against the night sky, the villages dark and quiet beyond, you feel the contrast deeply. Inside, abundance. Outside, scarcity. Inside, laughter. Outside, silence. And in that silence lies the true weight of the banquet, the knowledge that survival in this world was never shared equally. When the candles finally burned down to stubs and the hall returned to shadow, the feast did not truly end. Its echoes lingered in the bodies, in the memories, and in the rhythms of the medieval world. For the nobles, the consequences were often felt in their own health. Overindulgence was not a rare accident, it was almost an expectation. A lord might eat more meat in a single sitting than a peasant family consumed in a week. Wine, mead, and ale flowed freely, and restraint was seen less as a virtue than as a weakness. Doctors of the time, steeped in the ancient theories of humors, often warned against such excess. They spoke of imbalances in bile and phlegm, of heat and cold within the body. And though their language seems strange to us now, Their warnings were not without reason. Obesity, gout, digestive illnesses, and heart troubles haunted the nobility. The very abundance that symbolized their wealth often shortened their lives. Meanwhile, the poor, who lived largely on grains, legumes, and occasional scraps of meat, suffered from different afflictions: malnutrition, weakness, and susceptibility to disease. The banquet, then, was not merely a symbol of inequality in wealth, but in health as well. Rich or poor, no one escaped the consequences of their table. But the feast's legacy extended further than health. It shaped culture in ways both obvious and subtle. Recipes, carefully guarded by castle cooks, slowly trickled outward into monasteries, towns, and villages. The art of spicing food, learned from trade with the East, became a marker of status. To use cinnamon or cloves was to announce wealth, even if only in the smallest pinch. Over time, these flavors became part of the European palate, echoes of 1,000 forgotten banquets. Music, too, found its way into the wider world. The songs sung by minstrels and troubadours, often mere background to the laughter and clatter of knives, carried stories of knights, saints, and impossible loves. These stories were repeated, reshaped, and remembered, becoming part of the shared imagination of the Middle Ages. What began as entertainment in a feast hall became the legends that still echo today. Even the architecture of dining left its mark. The great hall, with its long tables and central hearth, became the heart of medieval castles and manors. Later, as centuries passed, the banquet evolved into more refined dining, but the symbolism remained. To eat together was to display unity, to celebrate, to mark one's place in society. Even today, in our family dinners and holiday feasts, we echo something of those medieval nights. Yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the medieval banquet lies in the lessons it leaves us. For all its grandeur, the feast was fleeting. Food spoiled, songs ended, laughter faded, and in the morning the castle was as cold and quiet as it had been the day before. The banquet promised abundance, but it always left behind emptiness in storerooms, in bodies, and often in the lives of those who had given so much to make it possible. In that sense, the banquet becomes almost a parable. It reminds us of the human tendency to display wealth, to measure status by consumption, to celebrate in ways that often leave others behind. The nobles of the Middle Ages may seem distant to us, but their habits are not entirely gone. Even now, we live in a world where some eat too much, while others struggle to find enough, where gatherings display success as much as they celebrate togetherness. And yet, there is also a softer lesson in those long-forgotten halls. The banquet, for all its inequality, was also a place of connection, to break bread together, to share wine, to listen to stories and music by firelight. These were experiences that tied people to one another, even if only within the narrow walls of privilege. It speaks to a deeper truth that across centuries, humans have always sought not only to survive, but to gather, to share, and to celebrate. As you let your thoughts drift back from those candlelit tables, you might ask yourself, how would you fare in such a world? Could you stomach the rich, greasy meats, the smoky air, the endless noise? Could you endure the hunger outside the gates, knowing your labor built a feast you could never join? Would you survive such a banquet, not only the food itself, but the world it represented? These are questions without easy answers. The banquet is long gone, but its lessons remain. It teaches us about inequality, about culture, about the fragile line between abundance and scarcity. And as you close your eyes tonight, letting the medieval world slip back into the shadows of history, perhaps you carry with you the quiet reminder that every feast, no matter how lavish, is temporary. What endures is the way it shapes the lives of those who sit at the table and those who never will. When you picture a medieval castle, the image that likely comes to mind is one of strength, towering stone walls, lofty battlements, and banners fluttering bravely in the wind. From a distance, these fortresses seem impenetrable, places where lords and ladies lived in comfort and safety, while soldiers guarded them from harm. But safety did not mean comfort, and inside those stone walls, winter brought a challenge that no moat, no drawbridge, no iron gate could keep away. Winter crept into every hall and chamber. It pressed against windows, it seeped beneath doors, and it lingered in the breath of every soul who tried to endure it. To survive the winter in a stone castle was no simple matter. It was a test not of wealth or power, but of endurance. Let's step inside, quietly, as though we ourselves are entering the great hall at the start of a long winter season. Stone is strong, but it is not warm. Castles were built for defense, not for comfort. Their walls were several feet thick, designed to repel invaders. But in the heart of winter, those same walls seemed to drink in the cold and hold it. In the great hall, the largest room of the castle, enormous hearths blazed with fires. Logs as long as a man was tall were rolled into the flames. Sparks leaped upward, and the smoke curled toward the rafters. Yet even here, warmth was fleeting. If you stood near the fire, your face and hands might glow with heat, but your back would remain chilled. Step just a few paces away, and the cold reclaimed you immediately, creeping through your boots, numbing your fingers, stiffening your breath. In the private chambers of the castle, conditions were even harsher. Fires there were smaller, often little more than piles of smoldering embers. Curtains were drawn around beds to trap what little warmth could be kept, and fur blankets were piled high. Still, frost crept along the inside of windows, and water in basins froze solid overnight. Nobles awoke to see their own breath hanging in the air. Servants slept on floors or in drafty corners, huddled together beneath thin coverings, their teeth chattering through the night. The cold was constant. It did not come and go like a passing storm. It lingered day after day, week after week, seeping into bones and spirits alike. Survival in a stone castle depended on preparation. When autumn ended, every household turned its attention toward storing enough food, firewood, and supplies to last the long season. The castle kitchens became places of furious activity. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked so it would not rot. Fish, caught in rivers or brought from the coast, was packed into barrels of brine. Grains were ground into flour and stored in sacks. Apples and pears were carefully laid in cellars, while hardy vegetables like turnips and cabbages were stored in cool rooms to last as long as possible. Herbs were hung from beams to dry, and honey was sealed in jars to sweeten meals when sugar was still a rare luxury. Firewood was gathered in enormous stacks, each log precious. Without enough fuel, fires could not be maintained, and without fires, even the strongest fortress became unbearable. Servants trudged daily to replenish supplies, splitting wood in the icy air until their fingers blistered and cracked. The steward, one of the most important officials in any castle, kept meticulous records of stores. He calculated how much grain could be used each week, how many barrels of ale could be tapped, and how long supplies might last if rationed carefully. A mistake in his accounts could mean hunger before spring returned. When winter settled fully, the rhythm of life revolved around meals. Food was both necessity and comfort, a reminder that survival was still possible. In the great hall, the lord and lady presided over meals from the high table, seated beneath a canopy that signified their rank. They were served first, and their dishes were richer. Roasted meats, spiced sauces, and fine bread made from sifted wheat. The household below them ate more humbly. Soldiers, guests, and lesser servants shared coarse bread made from rye or barley, thick pottages of beans and root vegetables, and small portions of salted meat. On days of plenty, there might be cheese or fish. On leaner days, meals dwindled to porridge and ale watered down to make it last. Hierarchy was reinforced at every table. The best cuts went to the nobles. Servants ate scraps, often gathered after others had finished. Yet even these leftovers were valued. In winter, nothing could be wasted. Bones were boiled again and again to flavor soups. Hardened crusts were softened in broth. Every morsel mattered. Feasts still occurred, often tied to the calendar of saints and holy days. On such occasions, spices from distant lands were brought forth, cinnamon, ginger, pepper, and the hall was filled with music and merriment. But even then, the air of restraint lingered. Everyone knew that the supplies in storerooms must last until spring, and each indulgence carried the shadow of scarcity. Beyond the great hall, survival required constant effort. Servants tended fires in every chamber, carrying heavy bundles of wood up steep staircases. Women spun wool into thicker clothing, patched garments, worn thin, and mended cloaks with fur linings to block the wind. Children gathered rushes from riverbanks to spread across floors, replacing old layers that had grown foul. In the stables, grooms battled against the cold to keep horses alive. Animals were as vital to survival as people, providing transport, labor, and, at times, food. Hay was rationed carefully, and water had to be broken from frozen troughs each morning. Guards and soldiers endured long watches upon the battlements, cloaks drawn tightly around them, eyes watering from the wind. Their torches flickered, their boots slipped on icy stones, yet their duty remained. For an enemy could still strike in winter, and defense could not falter, no matter the weather. Perhaps the greatest challenge of all was not the cold, nor the hunger, but the endless darkness. Winter nights stretched long, swallowing the hours. With no electricity, light came only from fires, torches, and candles, all of which consumed precious fuel. Once the sun set, the castle dimmed, work slowed. People huddled near hearths, speaking in low tones, telling stories, or simply sitting in silence. Sleep was broken into segments, interrupted by the cold. People often rose in the middle of the night to stir fires or pray in the chapel before returning to bed for a second rest. Dreams mingled with the howling of the wind, and the line between night and day seemed blurred. The mind grew weary in such conditions. Without the brightness of spring or summer, without the labor of fields to fill the hours, many found themselves weighed down by melancholy. Faith became essential, offering meaning to the struggle. Hope that endurance would be rewarded with the return of warmth and light. Winter in a stone castle was not a season of romance or grandeur. It was a season of endurance, marked by discipline, patience, and quiet resilience. For nobles, it meant restraining indulgence and relying on the loyalty of those who served them. For servants, it meant unending labor with little reward, each day a battle against exhaustion and cold. For all, it was a reminder that even stone walls could not shield them from the power of nature. And so the fires burned, the stores dwindled slowly, and the people of the castle waited, through long nights, through biting winds, through endless days of frost, for the promise of spring. But the question remained, whispered in the silence of corridors and the shadows of the great hall. Would the supplies, the strength, and the spirit of the household last until the thaw returned? The stone walls of the castle stood as monuments to power and defense. But inside those walls, the rhythm of life during winter was far slower, quieter, and heavier than any battle. What made survival possible was not only preparation, but the daily habits that stretched across the weeks. Habits repeated again and again, like the tick of a clock. You might imagine the castle as a sealed fortress, but in truth, it was full of cracks and gaps that let the cold seep inside. Windows were narrow slits, called arrow loops, designed for defense. In summer, they admitted light and air, but in winter, they became channels for icy wind. Even when shutters of wood or iron were drawn closed, the drafts whispered through every seam. People tried to block them. Cloth hangings were draped across walls. Tapestries depicting saints or scenes of hunting not only served as decoration, but as insulation. Rush mats were spread across stone floors, layered with straw and reeds to reduce the chill. In noble chambers, heavy curtains were hung from ceiling beams to create smaller, warmer spaces. Beds were enclosed with canopies and thick curtains so the sleeper could trap body heat within. Yet even with these efforts, the castle remained stubbornly cold. Servants joked that you could always tell the wealth of a household by how many layers people wore indoors. Some nobles donned fur-lined cloaks over their tunics. Women wore woolen dresses with additional undergarments of linen. Children bundled in everything available. Still, the stone seemed to swallow warmth faster than it could be created. For people of the castle, winter clothing was not fashion, it was survival. Wool was the most important material, spun from sheep that had been shorn the previous spring. Thick cloaks of wool, sometimes dyed in colors that displayed status, were prized possessions. Linen, though lighter, was used for underlayers, which could be changed and washed more frequently to maintain some sense of cleanliness. The wealthy could afford furs, fox, sable, ermine, or rabbit, sewn into linings or worn as collars and trims. These added not just warmth, but also prestige. Poorer folk relied on sheepskin, coarser, but still effective. Gloves were rare, but mittens of wool or leather were sometimes used, especially by those working outdoors. At night, even nobles rarely undressed fully. Instead, they slept in their day clothes or in a special layer called a night shift, wrapped in as many blankets and furs as possible. A chamber without a fire was so cold that undressing completely would have been unthinkable. At the center of survival was the fire. Fires never rested. The great hall's hearth was the largest, and their firewood was consumed in staggering quantities. Logs had to be carried in constantly, each one chopped, hauled, and arranged by servants who worked with reddened hands. Sparks flew upward into the smoky rafters, where beams darkened from centuries of soot. In noble chambers, smaller fireplaces glowed faintly. Charcoal braziers were sometimes used to provide additional warmth, though they carried the risk of smoke and fumes. Servants rose early to rekindle the embers each morning, and they stayed up late to tend them at night. To let a fire go out in winter was no small mistake. It meant hours of shivering before the flames could be coaxed to life again. The smell of wood smoke permeated everything. Clothing, hair, and bedding all absorbed it. To step outside briefly and then return inside was to notice immediately how thick the air of the castle had become, heavy with heat and smoke, but still pierced by the bite of the cold stone. In summer, the castle bustled with activity. Messengers rode in and out. Workers toiled in fields, and hunts filled the forests with horns and barking hounds. But in winter, movement slowed. Travel was dangerous. Fields lay barren, and hunting was limited. Life contracted inward. Time was filled with tasks that could be done indoors. Women spun wool, wove cloth, or embroidered tapestries. Men repaired weapons, polished armor, or mended tools. Children played small games near the fire, their laughter sometimes breaking the otherwise hushed halls. Priests and monks within the castle chapel conducted prayers at set hours, providing rhythm to otherwise indistinct days. Yet, despite these activities, hours often dragged. The sun set early and after dark. Candlelight or torchlight gave only dim illumination. Many people simply rested, conserving energy for the labor of tending fires or carrying supplies. Silence often stretched long in corridors, broken only by the sound of wind pressing against the walls or the crackle of a hearth fire. Hot meals were more than nourishment. They were a form of warmth. Stews and pottages simmered for hours in the kitchens, thick with beans, peas, or lentils. The longer they cooked, the richer the flavor, and the easier they were to digest. Bread was eaten with nearly every meal, though in winter it was often coarse and dark, made from rye or barley instead of wheat. Ale, brewed earlier in the year, was consumed daily by all, even children. Water was often unsafe, so ale provided both hydration and calories. On rare occasions, mulled wine might be prepared for the Lord's table, spiced and heated as a comfort against the cold. Food was always tied to hierarchy. The Lord's family received the best cuts of meat, richer sauces, and the occasional imported spice. Servants and soldiers had simpler fare, and at the bottom of the scale were the kitchen workers, who scraped together what remained after everyone else had eaten. Still, even the humblest bowl of warm stew offered a brief escape from the biting chill of the castle air. As night descended, the castle fell into a hush. The great hall's fire dimmed, corridors darkened, and people withdrew to their chambers. Outside, the wind pressed against battlements, carrying with it the howl of wolves or the creak of shifting trees. Inside, silence was broken only by the crack of firewood, the scuffle of a guard's boots, or the distant drip of water seeping through stone. The cold seemed to grow heavier as the hours stretched toward dawn. Sleep was not always deep. Many awoke in the night, shivering, to stir embers or adjust blankets. Some prayed quietly in the chapel, asking for endurance, for mercy, for spring to come swiftly. Others lay awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for morning light to seep faintly through narrow windows once again. Survival in a castle's winter was not guaranteed. It depended on the careful balance of preparation, labor, and endurance. Too little firewood and warmth would vanish. Too much food consumed too early, and hunger would strike before spring. Too much sickness among servants, and fires might go untended, or supplies might spoil. Every household lived with this awareness that wealth and stone walls could not fully insulate them from nature's power. Winter was a force greater than kings, greater than armies. It reduced all to the same essential struggles, simply to endure until the thaw returned. The winter within a stone castle was not the same for everyone. The towering walls enclosed lords and ladies, knights and squires, servants and guards, cooks and clerics, even livestock and hunting dogs. Each carried the burden of the cold season in their own way, some with more comfort, others with nothing but endurance. For the lord and his family, survival looked different, but it was not without hardship. Their chambers were the largest, often situated in towers or upper floors. These rooms were adorned with painted walls, carved furniture, and heavy curtains of dyed fabric. Yet even here, warmth was elusive. A blazing hearth might warm one side of the room, while the opposite wall remained icy to the touch. Nobles gathered close to the fire, cloaks draped around their shoulders, hands outstretched toward the flames. Meals were served hot and frequent, and fur-lined garments softened the edge of the chill. Still, sickness did not spare them. A cough in a noble's chamber could spread quickly among attendants and children. Despite wealth, medicine remained uncertain, and even the most luxurious bed could not guarantee restful sleep when the air itself felt damp with frost. For nobles, the winter was endured through comfort and patience, books of devotion to pass long hours, music from hired minstrels, or simple games played by the fire. Yet they too looked to the horizon for the promise of spring. Far harsher was the life of the castle guards. Stationed on walls and towers, they faced the wind head-on, their cloaks whipping in the icy air. Watches lasted hours, broken only by the change of shifts. Torches guttered in the wind, offering little warmth, and boots stiffened with frost as the night dragged on. When their watch ended, they descended to the barracks, where a communal fire and shared blankets gave some relief. But guards never fully escaped the cold. Even in rest, they carried the memory of endless hours beneath the winter stars, staring into a dark horizon where danger might come at any time. Perhaps the hardest burden of all fell to the servants. It was they who carried wood from distant stores, trudging across icy courtyards with arms full of logs. It was they who fetched water, breaking ice at the well, and lugging heavy buckets back through snow. It was they who scrubbed rushes from the floors, replaced damp bedding with fresh straw, and hauled endless supplies through freezing corridors. Servants rarely had furs or rich wool. Their clothes were patched, their boots worn thin. Many worked with hands raw from cold, lips cracked and bleeding. For them, fire was not a comfort to linger by, but a task to maintain for others. They often slept in crowded quarters, huddled together for warmth, blankets shared among many. Yet without servants, the castle could not survive. Their labor was the unseen foundation of winter endurance. Every noble's comfort, every guard's watch, every meal served depended upon their ceaseless effort. Even animals shared in the struggle. Hunting dogs, prized by lords, were kept in kennels, often brought indoors for warmth during the coldest nights. Horses remained in stables, where straw bedding and their own body heat created a measure of comfort, though grooms had to work constantly to keep stalls clean and animals fed. Cattle, pigs, and sheep were sometimes housed within the outer walls, their breath mingling with the frosty air. The presence of animals added warmth and odor to castle life. In a strange way, the castle was not just a fortress of people, but of beasts, all sheltering together against the season. In times of hardship, faith was a companion. The castle chapel, small but sacred, was a place where people gathered daily. Candles flickered against stone, their light soft and fragile in the winter gloom. Priests led prayers for endurance, for health, for deliverance from famine or plague. The rhythm of bells marked hours of devotion, punctuating the stillness of days. For some, faith was a comfort, for others, a duty. But in either case, it offered structure, reminding all that even in the harshest winters, there was order beyond the cold. What made winter in a castle so profound was not just the cold, or the hunger, or the work. It was the length of the nights. Darkness fell early, long before tasks were done, and lingered late into the morning. Those who lay awake in bed heard the creaks of timber beams, the scratch of rats in the rushes, or the distant howl of wolves beyond the walls. The silence pressed heavily, making every sound sharper. For some, this was a time of reflection, of whispered stories or prayers. For others, it was simply an endurance of waiting, waiting for sleep, waiting for morning, waiting for spring. What united all within the castle, noble and servant, guard and priest, animal and child, was the shared reality of survival. No matter rank or wealth, no one could escape the chill entirely. The castle itself, strong against armies, was weak against winter. Its stone kept them safe from swords, but not from the creeping cold. And so, each person did what they could, the noble wrapped in fur, the guard stamping his boots, the servant feeding the hearth, the priest lighting a candle, the child clinging to a blanket. Together they endured. Winter in a stone castle was not only a test of warmth, it was a test of hunger, of planning, of patience stretched across endless weeks when the earth gave nothing and the fields lay silent. At first, in the early days of winter, the granaries and pantries still felt full. Baskets of dried beans, sacks of grain, salted meats hanging from hooks, barrels of ale, and jars of honey-lined storerooms. The sight was reassuring, almost comforting, a promise that the castle could endure the long months ahead. But as the snow thickened outside, as each day passed, those storerooms began to empty, and the mood inside the castle shifted with every meal served. The granary was the castle's true treasure chest. Within its thick walls, sacks of grain were stacked high, carefully measured and guarded. Wheat, rye, oats, and barley each had its purpose. Wheat for the Lord's bread, rye and barley for the household, oats for the horses. Servants measured the stores daily, noting the slow decline. A scoop removed here, a handful spilled there, a sack emptied and replaced. Every calculation mattered. Too much generosity in the early weeks could mean starvation later. Too much strictness could lead to unrest among the hungry mouths. The steward, responsible for managing the stores, walked with quiet authority. His tally stick marked what was taken, what remained, what must be rationed. The granary was not only a store of food, but of trust, a fragile balance between plenty and scarcity. Bread was the heart of every meal. For the noble family, white bread made from wheat flour was baked in the castle ovens, its soft texture and pale color a mark of privilege. For soldiers and servants, darker loaves made from rye or barley were the norm, coarser and heavier, but filling nonetheless. On cold days, these loaves were eaten with broth or stew, dipped into hot liquid to soften the tough crust. Sometimes bread was so central that it doubled as a utensil. Large, thick slices called trenchers were placed beneath meat or stew, soaking up juices before being eaten or discarded to the poor. In winter, even these trenchers were valuable, never wasted. But as weeks dragged on, flour dwindled. Bread became smaller, denser, less frequent. The taste of abundance gave way to the taste of necessity. If bread was the foundation, pottage was the comfort. Pottage was a simple stew, made from whatever ingredients were at hand. In summer, it could be rich with fresh vegetables and herbs. In winter, it became plainer: beans, peas, lentils, sometimes onions or leeks, simmered slowly over the fire. Meat was rare, often added only as a flavoring. A bone from a salted ham might be dropped into the pot, removed and reused again and again, lending its flavor to many meals. The pottage was never truly finished. It was replenished daily, simmering endlessly, a living pot that changed slightly with each new ingredient. This humble dish fed everyone, from the Lord's household to the lowliest servant. The difference lay only in quality: more spices and vegetables at the high table, thinner fare at the bottom of the hall. But even a thin bowl of warm pottage was welcome in the depths of winter. Protein in winter came not from fresh hunts or markets, but from preservation. Fish, salted or dried, was common, especially on days of religious fasting when meat was forbidden. The barrels of salted herring or cod were opened carefully, their sharp scent filling storerooms. These fish, caught months earlier, had traveled from distant coasts to supply the castle in its inland isolation. Meat was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. Pork, more than any other, filled the larders, for pigs could be slaughtered and cured in autumn. Sausages hung from rafters, salted beef lay in brine, and smoked hams dangled darkly above kitchen fires. These meats were rationed carefully, often reserved for the Lord's table or for feasts. For the majority, meat was rare, a small cube floating in pottage, or the flavor of bones boiled until nothing remained but a thin broth. Water was rarely trusted, especially in winter, when wells froze or grew stagnant. Instead, ale was the daily drink, brewed in large quantities during the warmer months and stored in barrels for winter. It was weak by modern standards, closer to liquid bread than intoxicating drink. Even children consumed it, for it was safer than untreated water. For the lord's household, wine was imported, often mulled with spices, and served warm. Such luxuries were rare and carefully treasured, a taste of faraway lands in the bleak northern cold. Despite careful planning, hunger was a constant companion. Servants, working long hours, often had little more than thin bread and broth, their stomachs growling as they hauled logs or fetched water. Guards on night watch chewed on crusts to keep alert in the bitter wind. Children cried quietly when their bowls were smaller than before. Even nobles felt the difference. Meals grew simpler, courses fewer, flavors less rich. Spices, once symbols of wealth, became scarce as storerooms emptied. The joy of dining faded into the necessity of eating just enough to endure. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at the spirit. It made tempers shorter, work heavier, and days longer. Yet everyone understood the stakes. To eat too freely now was to risk disaster before spring. Rationing was an art of survival. The steward walked a fine line, ensuring food lasted but not allowing despair to take hold. He might quietly reduce bread portions by half, stretch pottage with more water, or forbid second helpings at the lower tables. He might secretly reserve certain stores for emergencies, unlocking them only when hunger threatened to overwhelm. The fairness of rationing mattered. If nobles feasted while servants starved, resentment brewed. If guards went hungry, defense weakened. Thus, many lords allowed their families to reduce extravagance in winter, not out of kindness, but out of necessity, for the stability of the household depended on it. Scarcity was not only physical, but psychological. To walk past the granary and see fewer sacks each week was a reminder of how long winter stretched ahead. To know that snow still lay thick on the ground, that no seed could be sown, that no market cart would arrive, was to feel the weight of helplessness. As the weeks of winter deepened, hunger was no longer the only shadow haunting the stone halls. The cold itself carried dangers, subtle at first, but soon unavoidable. Within the walls of the castle, where hundreds of bodies shared the same fires, the same food, the same stale air, sickness became a quiet, creeping guest. The castle could keep out raiders, wolves, or the worst of the wind, but it could not keep out illness. For most people, the chill of winter was not a passing discomfort. It was a constant companion. Even indoors, wrapped in rough wool or furs, cold air lingered in the corners of the stone rooms. Drafts slipped beneath doors, through arrow slits, down stairwells. The poor, sleeping near kitchens or in servants' chambers, often lay huddled together on straw pallets, their breath clouding the air above them. Blankets were scarce, fires were rationed, and nights were long. Colds and coughs spread quickly in such conditions. A single sneeze during mealtime might echo days later as a wave of sickness moving through the entire hall. To us today, it may sound trivial, but in an age without antibiotics or effective medicine, even a simple cold could spiral into a dangerous fever, a lingering weakness, or worse. Cleanliness in a stone castle was far from easy. Water had to be hauled in buckets from wells, cisterns, or rivers, often freezing along the way. Bathing was rare in winter, not only because of the cold, but because of limited fuel to heat water. Most people washed only their faces and hands, perhaps rinsing feet on special days. Clothing was worn for weeks, sometimes months, before being cleaned. Wool absorbed odors and smoke. Linen undergarments, when available, absorbed sweat, but were not washed as often as one might hope. Chamber pots, emptied too infrequently, filled the air with unpleasantness. Latrines, though sometimes built into castle walls to empty waste outside, could freeze or overflow, spreading filth into living areas. In these conditions, fleas and lice thrived. Vermin crept through straw bedding, gnawed at food stores, and multiplied in the dark corners of storerooms. Every itch could be a reminder that cleanliness was more hope than habit. In the close quarters of a wintering castle, the air grew stale. Fires filled rooms with smoke, candles with soot. Windows, such as they were, remained shuttered against the cold, shutting in not only warmth but also sickness. Diseases passed from one to another with ease. Influenza-like fevers, respiratory infections, stomach illnesses. The lack of fresh fruit or vegetables meant weakened immune systems, and wounds, even small ones, often became infected. For children, the elderly, or the weak, winter was often fatal. A cough could deepen into pneumonia, a fever into delirium, an infection into death. Even the noble family, with their better food and warmer chambers, were not immune. Illness cared nothing for rank. Medicine in the medieval world was a mixture of herbs, prayers, and hope. The castle's herb wife or healer might brew infusions of thyme, sage, or garlic for coughs. Honey was prized for soothing throats. Hot wine spiced with cloves might be given to warm the body, while vinegar was sometimes used to wash wounds. But alongside these practical remedies were beliefs rooted in superstition. Illness might be blamed on foul air, on the alignment of planets, or even on sign. Prayers, charms, or relics were sought for protection. Bleeding or purging was sometimes prescribed, thought to rebalance the humors of the body, though often it weakened patients further. Leeching, too, was a common practice, clinging to the belief that illness could be drawn out by releasing blood. The result was uneven at best. Some recovered, some lingered, some faded. When sickness spread, one chamber might be set aside as an infirmary. The sick were laid on pallets or benches, tended by servants or by fellow family members. Fires burned low, both to conserve wood and because smoke worsened the air. Bowls of broth or weak ale were given, though often the sick had little appetite. The sound of coughing became part of the winter's rhythm, a grim counterpoint to the clatter of daily life. The smell of illness, of sweat and fever, hung heavy in the air. In some castles, a priest might visit to offer blessings or the last rites. For those who survived, weakness could linger for weeks. For those who did not, death came quietly. One more reminder of how fragile life was within even the strongest walls. Burying the dead in winter was a grim task. The ground, frozen hard, resisted the spade. In some cases, bodies were kept in chapels or outbuildings until the thaw allowed proper burial. In smaller households, makeshift graves might be dug in shallow earth, marked with stones or wooden crosses. Death was not rare, nor was it hidden. It was a reality that shaped winter life, a whispered reminder at every mealtime, a shadow at every cough. Yet people carried on because they had no choice. Survival demanded endurance, not only of the body, but of the spirit. And so the castle endured its winters, not only against the cold and hunger, but against sickness itself. Each year was a gamble. How many would survive? How many would fall? How long the stores and the strength of the household would last? To live in a medieval castle was not to escape hardship. It was merely to face it within walls of stone, with company enough to share both the struggle and the loss. When food ran thin and illness crept through the rooms, something else became vital. Not bread or ale, but structure. The daily rhythms of a medieval castle gave people a sense of order, a framework to cling to in the darkness of winter. It was not only survival of the body that mattered, but survival of the spirit. Life inside the castle followed the toll of the bell. At dawn, even in the deep of winter, when the sun was slow to rise, a bell would call the household to prayer. The castle chapel, small and dimly lit with flickering candles, became a gathering place. The priest or chaplain read verses, voices murmured responses, and the people prayed for protection, for health, for the safe passing of winter. Prayer was not simply ritual. For many, it was a rhythm that anchored the day, a reminder that life had meaning beyond hunger or cold. The words offered a kind of warmth, a steady beat against the uncertainty of the world outside. After prayer came work. Even in winter, there was always work. Servants swept the halls, carried water, scrubbed wooden floors with sand or straw. Kitchen workers tended the fires, stirred pots, checked food stores, and baked coarse loaves of bread from dwindling supplies. Children gathered kindling or ran small errands. For the noble household, mornings might be spent in small councils or tasks of administration, checking accounts, discussing disputes, or planning repairs for spring. Winter slowed the outside world, but it did not stop the affairs of a lord's domain. These daily routines gave structure to lives that might otherwise have dissolved into despair. In a world of cold and scarcity, even simple tasks could feel like proof that life continued. Other chores were less ordinary, but essential. Fuel had to be managed carefully. Servants chopped and carried wood, stacking it near kitchens and chambers. Dung and peat were dried for burning, though their smoke was thick and unpleasant. Clothing, too, required care. Woolen cloaks and tunics were patched. Boots were repaired with scraps of leather. Children outgrew their garments quickly, and so clothes were passed down, altered, or repurposed. In the stables, horses and livestock required feeding and care. Animals were life itself, providers of milk, meat, or strength for labor. Their survival meant the survival of the household. Tending them was a chore that could not be delayed, no matter the weather. Faith wove itself through these tasks. Each meal, however meager, began with thanks to God. Each illness was met with prayer. Every death was marked by ritual, a burial, if possible, or at least words spoken over the departed. The chapel stood at the center of this spiritual life. Inside, the cold stone echoed with chants, lit by wavering candlelight. The air was heavy with incense when supplies allowed. It was believed that prayers might ward off sickness, or that penance could turn away famine. Relics were touched, charms worn, and blessings sought. For the castle household, faith was more than belief. It was a survival tool, a way to endure what reason and medicine could not solve. As darkness fell, and in winter, darkness came early, the castle settled into its evening rhythms. The main hall, though smoky and crowded, offered company and light. After the evening meal, some entertained themselves with storytelling or music. A servant might play a lute, a visiting bard might sing, or elders might share tales of old battles and ancestors long gone. These gatherings did not erase hunger or illness, but they gave people something else to hold on to: community. In the glow of firelight, with voices weaving stories through the hall, people found moments of laughter, or at least distraction. Yet there were nights when no music was played, when sickness hushed the hall and mourning filled the air. Still, even silence had its place. People prayed quietly, stitched garments, or sharpened tools by candlelight. Families huddled together, whispering hopes that the worst of the winter would pass. The rhythm of work, prayer, meals, and rest kept despair at bay. By midwinter, the household often knew who would endure and who would not. Losses were felt deeply, but life moved forward. The faint lengthening of days was noticed. Candle stubs burned a little shorter before bedtime. The horizon, though bleak and cold, hinted that spring was not forever lost. Hope, though fragile, lived in these small changes. And so routines continued. One more prayer, one more chore, one more day endured. The castle's winter was more than hunger or sickness. It was the testing of patience, faith, and endurance. Work gave people something to hold. Faith gave them something to believe in. And routine gave them something to follow when the world seemed unchanging. In the great rhythm of medieval life, the beating of the bell and the glow of the hearth. When most people picture a medieval castle, their minds go to banners waving above tall towers, to noble lords dining on golden plates, or knights returning from battle with shining armor. The vision is clean, heroic, and grand. Yet beneath the weight of all that stone, another world existed, a world of labor, noise, and endless motion. It was the world of the servants. The great hall may have been the heart of a castle, but it was a heart that beat only because hundreds of unseen hands kept it alive. From dawn until long after dusk, servants worked in the shadows, bending their backs to tasks no one celebrated, yet without which no feast, no battle, and no winter survival would have been possible. The day for a servant began before the sun had even thought of rising, while the lord's family still dreamed beneath wool blankets, and the hall lay dark and silent. The servants stirred awake in corners of the castle most would never notice. Some slept in drafty chambers near the kitchens, others in lofts above storerooms, their bedding little more than straw. Cloaks and tunics doubled as blankets, and the winter air bit through the cracks. There were no soft mattresses, no roaring fires waiting for them. Their warmth came from huddling close, or from the hope that work itself would warm them soon enough. At first light, and often before it, their tasks began. Fires had to be lit in the kitchens. Water had to be hauled in buckets from wells or cisterns. Heavy loads carried up slippery stairs. Bread dough needed kneading. The noble family expected warmth and food when they stirred, and it was the servant's duty to make sure those needs were already met. There was no question of delay. To falter in these tasks was to risk harsh words, punishment, or dismissal, and dismissal, in the depths of winter, could be a death sentence. Much of a servant's life was spent moving, carrying loads up and down, from place to place, endlessly. The kitchens demanded water for boiling, washing, and brewing. Buckets sloshed as boys and girls trod the same path over and over. Barrels of ale or wine had to be rolled into the hall, sacks of grain hauled from storerooms. Coal or wood for the hearths required steady attention. Logs had to be split, carried, stacked, ashes removed, fires stoked, embers nursed back into flame. In a castle with dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, these fires could never be allowed to go cold. And always, the weight of things, sacks of flour, baskets of turnips, jars of salt, pressing down on the backs of those whose names were never recorded. The heart of the great hall was its table, and the heart of the table was food. Yet preparing food for a castle was no small affair. Servants worked under cooks to peel root vegetables, gut fish, pluck geese, grind grain into meal. They prepared pies of venison, roasted whole boars, and stewed pottages thick with barley and beans. The noble family expected variety, but variety required endless chopping, pounding, and stirring. Fires smoked, pots boiled over, grease spattered. Kitchens were hot, loud, and dangerous. Burns were common, as were cuts from dull knives or slips on greasy floors. Yet little notice was paid to these wounds. Servants bound their injuries as best they could and carried on. For all their effort, their own meals were far humbler. Servants ate scraps, bread too stale for the high table, pottage too thin for the nobles, bones stripped of their meat. Hunger was often their companion, even as they prepared feasts that dazzled the lords and their guests. What the nobles enjoyed, the servants had to clean. After banquets, the hall was left in disarray, bones scattered, grease staining the floors, rushes crushed beneath boots. Servants swept and scrubbed, gathering refuse to throw beyond the castle walls. In winter, this task grew fouler still, as scraps froze and clung to the ground, and vermin prowled close. Chamber pots from the noble family's rooms had to be emptied. Laundry, though rarely washed, still demanded hours of soaking, beating, and drying in the cold air. The smell of sweat, smoke, and waste clung to the castle, no matter how often servants scrubbed. Few visitors ever noticed the cleaners. Fewer still thanked them. Their work was meant to be invisible, their presence erased as soon as the hall shone again. When the lord and his family retired, servants' duties were not finished. Fires had to be banked to burn slowly through the night. Dogs had to be fed, doors barred, and corridors patrolled. Only then could the servants rest, often sprawled on hard benches, curled in corners of the hall itself, or huddled in the kitchens where warmth lingered. Their sleep was light, broken easily by the call of another task, or by the chill that crept back once the fires dimmed. For them, there was little distinction between day and night. Only work, then rest, then more work again. Not all servants lived the same life. Some were bound by service, tied to the Lord's household from birth. Others were hired hands, working for wages or food. A few, such as stewards or chamberlains, held positions of authority, trusted to manage others. But for the majority, the scullions, the water carriers, the sweepers, there was no honor, only toil. Their names rarely appeared in records, their lives passing unnoticed except in the tally of food consumed or labor completed. Even so, they were essential. Without them, The noble family could not dine, the castle could not function, and the walls would crumble from neglect. History remembers kings and queens, battles and treaties. It remembers the feasts held in great halls, the banners unfurled, the knights honored. But history often forgets the hands that carried those banners, cooked those feasts, and cleaned those halls. The servants of the great hall lived lives of obscurity, their labor constant, their names unrecorded. Yet they were the pulse of the castle, the steady rhythm that allowed all else to exist. When we think of servants in a castle, it is easy to imagine them only as hands, hands that scrubbed floors, stirred pots, or hauled water. Yet behind every hand was a life. A boy who once played in the mud of a village lane, a girl who learned to carry a bucket before she learned to read. Men and women whose names, though forgotten, carried stories of struggle, hope, and small triumphs. For many, service began early. Children of peasants, sometimes no older than 7 or 8, were sent into the household of a lord. This was both opportunity and necessity. A peasant family, struggling to feed too many mouths, might send a child into service in exchange for food, shelter, and the faint chance of advancement. These children were thrust into a new world. Gone were the familiar fields and cottages of their villages. Instead, they entered stone corridors filled with echoes, rules, and strangers. They learned quickly how to bow, when to speak, when to keep silent. Mistakes were punished, often harshly, yet service offered survival, and survival was enough. Child servants fetched water, gathered wood, or stood for hours holding candles. They ran messages through drafty stairwells, their bare feet slapping against cold stone. Sleep was scarce, play scarcer still. Childhood in a castle was rarely carefree. Yet even in such lives, bonds formed. Servants shared not only their work but their hardships. A boy carrying logs might share a whispered joke with a girl hauling water, and the two would laugh quietly in the shadows of the hall. Young servants often clung to one another, offering comfort in stolen moments of rest. Friendships became lifelines in a world where comfort was otherwise rare. Older servants looked out for younger ones, teaching them tricks, how to warm hands over embers without being seen, how to sneak an extra crust of bread from the kitchen, how to avoid the steward's temper. These small lessons passed down, forming invisible threads of connection. It was within these friendships that servants found a sense of belonging. However fragile, discipline in a medieval castle was strict. For nobles, dignity and order had to be preserved at all costs, and servants bore the brunt of enforcing that order. A servant who broke a dish, spilled wine, or spoke out of turn might be cuffed, beaten, or denied food. Public punishments were not uncommon. A boy caught stealing scraps could be whipped before others, a warning to all. Even minor mistakes, being late, moving too slowly, failing to bow properly, might bring swift rebuke. Stewards and overseers ensured that fear, as much as duty, kept the castle running. Yet servants endured. Punishments were expected, woven into life itself. The sting of a slap or the ache of hunger became part of their memory, something to be carried silently. Still, life was not only hardship. Even in the narrowest corridors of duty, joy found its way. A servant might pause, just for a heartbeat, to warm in a patch of sunlight breaking through a high window. Children chased one another briefly in courtyards before being called back to work. At feast days or festivals, servants too shared in the extra food, the laughter, the music that filled the hall. Stories were told in whispers at night, huddled under blankets or cloaks. Tales of saints, of monsters, of distant lands. Laughter rippled quietly, the sound of humanity refusing to be silenced. Sometimes, in rare kindness, a noble might notice a servant's loyalty and offer a coin, a kind word, or even clothing cast down from the high family. Such gifts, small to those of wealth, meant everything to those of service. Servants often lived their entire lives in obscurity. Their names were seldom recorded, their stories rarely told. Yet, among themselves, identity thrived. Nicknames abounded. Red for the boy with fiery hair, Mole for the girl who always worked in the dark kitchens, Sparrow for the child who darted swiftly through the hall with messages. These names carried affection, belonging, a kind of recognition denied them by history. Through such bonds and small joys, servants sustained themselves. Though forgotten by chronicles, their lives were rich in their own quiet way, rich with endurance, with shared struggle, and with the simple will to continue. The forgotten servants of the great hall were not only workers, they were children, friends, and human beings with hopes, fears, and fleeting joys. Their world was often harsh, their days filled with labor, but within that life, they forged connections that history has rarely remembered. And so, we come to the end of tonight's long journey through history. We've wandered into the great halls, where banquets were less glamorous than they first appeared. We've stepped into the cold stone walls of a castle in winter, and we've listened for the quiet voices of the forgotten servants who once moved unseen through those same corridors. Each of these stories, though faded in the pages of history, has given us a glimpse into lives that were real, ordinary, and deeply human. People who struggled, people who worked, and people who endured, often without recognition. Now, as the echoes of the past fade into silence, I hope this journey has brought you a sense of calm, perhaps even a gentle sleep. As the details of long ago lives drift softly in your mind, take a slow, deep breath. Let the weight of the day settle. The world of the past has closed its doors for tonight, but tomorrow it will open again, because the next story will be even more fascinating, even more unexpected, and even more revealing. If you've found comfort here, stay with us. There are countless histories still waiting to be told. So, rest well, let the night carry you gently, and we'll meet again soon for another quiet walk through the forgotten corners of time. Good night.